All right. This is an oral history interview conducted on behalf of the 11th Circuit Historical Society with the Honorable James C. Hill, who is a senior circuit judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. My name is Thomas E. Baker. I am the Alvin R. Allison Professor of Law at the Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. We are meeting in Jacksonville, Florida, in Judge Hill's chambers this morning, and the date is July 15th, 1997. Judge Hill, I appreciate very much your willingness to do this interview.
Well, I thank you very much, Tom, and I appreciate your willingness to come and perform this task and do this interview. It's also great to see you since you were in chambers some years ago. And it seemed to me that it might be a sort of an exercise in self-adulation to be sitting before a camera and interviewed about your career and your life and all your various doings, but I'm advised by people who appear to, or at least purport to know about such things as archives and history and court histories, that it is or might be helpful to have oral histories by all of the judges who sit on the court. So, thus reassured, I'll just embark with some enthusiasm on this ego trip and without apology.
Well, Judge, I appreciate very much your sense of humility, but I agree with your idea that these oral history interviews are valuable resources for generations to come and to gain the insights of jurists and lawyers with distinguished careers as your own. Most histories begin biographically with someone's roots and family history. Can you give us a short family history of where your forebears immigrated from, where they settled? Talk a little bit about your family roots.
Well, my father was about the third or fourth, at least, maybe fifth generation living in Darlington County, South Carolina. He has English background. His name is Hill, and I've often said that when your name is Hill, you get the opportunity to claim kin to a philanthropist now and then, but on the same day you have to deny kin to a horse thief. There are so many of us. My mother had a more unusual name. Her name was Clinkscales.
And that's your middle name? That's
my middle name, named for her father, James Clinkscales. And she grew up in Abbeville County, South Carolina, in what we call the upcountry. The Clinkscales immigrated from Scotland, I think in about 1735. A Clinkscales showed up, and appropriately for the beginning of the family, named Adam, in, I think, Port Tobacco, Virginia. And the clan moved down from there. Mother had a complete history of the Clinkscales clan. They were nice folks. They were never, I think, people of any great wealth. They did a lot of farming. Her father and the generation before had accumulated a number of properties in Abbeville County and around that area, I think over in Washington, Wilkes County, Georgia. And they lost a great deal of it in the Civil War as a result of the Civil War. Yeah, I think they lost a good deal of that. But the property was still there, but it wasn't worked very well, and finally distributed to the children of James Clinkscale, including mother, and my brother and sister and I just sold the last of her part of that about a year or two ago.
Well, that's a great Southern tradition of being land poor.
That's it. So during the Depression, they'd make one bale. Her rent was one bale of cotton, but it wouldn't pay the taxes. that's what it was. But that was they're nice folks. Oddly enough, my father's name was Albertus, and my mother's name was Alberta. So that was the Latin male and female got together. My father was a pharmacist, ran a drugstore for something over 50 years in Darlington, South Carolina. Darlington's county seat had about 6,000 or 7,000 people. Then a rather sleepy little town with some pretensions of society. The truth is, Darlington resented the noise of railroad trains so much that they declined to become a railroad center, and Florence, some 10 or 12 miles away, became the municipality, and Darlington remained the quiet little town until, but after I left, a fellow named Brasington built a racetrack there for automobiles, and now it's somewhat famous. Now it became famous for that, but it's quite inappropriate, too, to my recollection of that.
Well, now, Judge, you were born January 8th, 1924, and so that puts you at about 5 years old on Black Monday, the day the stock market crashed. You mentioned just a moment ago the Depression. What was it like growing up in the South during the Great Depression?
To be a child during those days, you don't get the full impact of it. I think I know more about what it was like to be in the Depression years, looking back on it as an adult. My father and mother had, I think, made great success of the store, or they were making what they thought was a never-ending success in the late 20s. They built a beautiful home on Spring Street in Darlington. It was built, finished about 6 months after I was born. I beat the builder. But after the crash and the Depression hit, of course it took a little while for it to simmer down to Darlington, they sold that house. Until she died, my mother would never admit that they lost it. She said they voluntarily sold it, and I know they voluntarily sold it because they couldn't possibly pay for it.
Make the mortgage payments?
Yeah. And we moved to a less pretentious place, and that must have been just a heartbreak, you know, for the parents. I didn't know it. It's all right for me to live in one house as the other.
The pharmacy kept going, though, during the Depression?
It almost put my father in the hospital. It did put him in the hospital, but he kept it going. At one time, he took the books that showed that the store was bankrupt 3 times over, got in his car, and went and called on all the wholesalers who served him and said, if you ship me COD, I'm gone. But if you'll keep me on credit, I think I can pull it out. He did, kept the doors open, as he used to say, and wound up in the Veterans Administration Hospital because he was about 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed something like 115 pounds.
And he himself was a veteran of World War I?
Yeah, he was in the war. He said he looked very carefully to find the safest thing he could do and decided that being an aid man, because he was a pharmacist, would be it. And he was in Norfolk, Virginia to ship overseas when the war ended. He told me as a child that the Kaiser heard he was coming, and so the Kaiser quit. But the truth is he was tending to wounded coming back, and he said everyone that was blown all to pieces had that little caduceus on of an aid man, and he had chosen the wrong thing. Fortunately, he didn't get in any trouble. He was discharged to come back and help as a pharmacist deal with the flu epidemic of 1918 that swept across the country.
And you had a brother and a sister?
My brother's 2 years older than I, and a sister 4 years younger. My brother's Albert Michael Jr., and my sister Eleanor Jean lives out of Charleston now, and my brother lives here in Jacksonville.
Well, now let's move to World War II. You were a senior in high school in 1939 when the war broke out in Europe?
September of '39, I would have been a junior, I think.
Junior?
I graduated in June of 40. No, September 3rd, I was a senior. I was going in as a senior, and that's when the war started. And I was, 15 years old, I guess. It became...
You were ahead of yourself in school.
Well, I had a lucky break. I think my mother was not thrilled with the group of kids I was in school with, because my birthday being in January, I could not enter first grade with the rest of them, the cutoff date being first of the year. And so in the third grade, or after the second grade, she employed the teacher of the third grade to teach me in the summer, and I got third grade credits by bicycling over to her house and studying. And so that put me a little ahead. I graduated from high school at age 16 in June of 40.
And in high school, you were on the debate team?
Well, yes, and I want to tell you, as I said, I do this ego trip. Jack Gardner and I were the state champions in debate. We won the state championship. It thrilled Miss Susie Brunson, who was the principal of our high school, so much she interrupted all the classes and ran around telling them about it.
Very good.
Yeah, we had a wonderful time, particularly because the debate coach thought the other two kids that were debating would be his first team, and Jack and I whipped them.
See, an advocate at an early age.
Yeah, great fun too. I can remember that issue right now.
And so, since you graduated early, it was off to the University of South Carolina in 1940, and you were there between 40 and 43 when World War II took you away. How did you choose to go to the University of South Carolina? Tell us a little bit about those years and those activities.
Well, there was no question where you'd go. You'd go to a state university. The idea of kids going off to some expensive private Ivy League school never crossed anybody's mind. We'd either go to Carolina or Clemson, and if you were a Carolina fan, you wouldn't think of submitting yourself to the other school if you were a Clemson fan the same way. And so, and my brother had already gone. He was 2 years there. So I joined him, and loved it. Great school. I was on the school newspaper, the Gamecock, and we dug up proof that at one time we had achieved 2,000 students.
Back then, that was a record to have a student body of 2,000?
That's the biggest record we had, yeah. I think it's about 35,000.
And did you pursue debate in college?
Yes, I was on the debating team, but the war limited travel. They used to have marvelous trips. They'd travel up east and down across the southern trip. But we didn't get to do much of that. We debated in the Euphratian Literary Society.
Well, that sounds impressive. What was that?
Oh, it was a literary society. It was a debating hall. We had 2 of them on campus. And we debated the issues of the day. One time we debated, I think it was the extension of the draft until midnight, and gave up and came back the next week and debated it again until about midnight. We passed the resolution after midnight, and the next day the Congress passed it, same resolution, by 1 vote.
So the Congress took your guidance?
We expect so. I think so, sure. But those were good things. We had fun.
And do I have it right that you were in the band for the Fighting Gamecocks?
Yes, I played, I tell you, in high school we had a little fellow named Gainey who had us a little band, and I played about 3rd cornet. And I thought I was not fit for a sophisticated college band, but I heard them play, and they were playing the same stuff. So I went to the dean of the School of Business Administration, who was also the band director, and said, I can play 3rd cornet, I think, in that. He said, well, that's fine. If you can do that, you can play the E-flat alto, can't you? I said, I don't know. I never heard of one.
I don't know what that is myself.
Well, it's the horn that when the bass goes it goes pop.
So your contribution to the fighting band, the Gamecocks fighting band, was the pop
after the oomp, and if the bass forgot to say oomp, I didn't say pop. That's right.
Well, now, you served in World War II yourself, and we should talk about your service during the war. Judge Paul Roney tells a story about having dinner with you and Judge Frank Johnson, and discussing what the 3 of you did during World War II. And apparently Judge Johnson was in a unit in Europe that was bombed by our own planes. and I think the general's name was McNair. General McNair was killed in one of these attacks. And at that dinner, according to Judge Roney, you explained that you were in the unit in England, perhaps, that made that mistake. And Judge Roney tells a story that Johnson, who sometimes disagreed with you as a judge, turned to him and said, "I never understood how that happened until now."
I remember that well. It was a tragic thing, but also an understandable thing. After the invasion of the continent, there was a real stall before Saint-Lô. And a general on the ground worked out a plan to have saturation bombing of a whole big area, many square miles, right in front of the American troops, and then they could move in. It was sort of the complement to the old artillery barrages in the First World War. And the 8th Air Force was not equipped for strategic work in front of the troops. The 9th Air Force did that. We were, I mean technical work. We did strategic bombing of plants cities and things of that sort. But they set up the 8th Air Force to just go around and one after the other pour the bombs down right on the same area, and it was a terrible thing. I mean, terribly effective. And there apparently was a little ground breeze that nobody knew and drifted some of the debris back over the American troops, and they were dropping right on the drops in front of them, and it killed some people. I talked to one of the young men who was down there later. I said, "I guess you're pretty angered at the 8th Air Force." He said, "No, we didn't think you flyboys did anything." But boy, when we saw what happened, it was very impressive. Incidentally, I was not one of those flyboys.
You were a cryptographer?
I was a cryptographer.
Now, how did that come about? How did
I was colorblind, and they wouldn't let me fly. And I had been building model airplanes since childhood, and I was going to blow the Hun out of the air single-handed, you know. Very disappointed. But we got to the classification, what I could do, and we started the classification book at A, and we got into the C's and came across cryptography, and that sounded pretty interesting, codes and ciphers. And so I said, sign me up, and that's how I became a cryptographer.
And so they trained you here before you shipped out overseas?
I went to Paulding, New York, to a private school up there. First American troops stationed there since George Washington brought the troops there from the Battle of White Plains, they told us. And it was almost like a school instead of a military unit. But once you were trained as a cryptographer, there was no use for you in this country. So I joined the 390th Bombardment Group, B-17 outfit, out in Great Falls, Montana, which was just about finished and ready to ship over, and went over with that group and stayed with it.
And you were near London in England?
Well, everything's near London in England, which surprises you. I thought we were very close, but we were out in East Suffolk, at a little town of Framlingham, has a castle where Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned, and had an aerodrome at a village called Parham. And we stayed there for the duration of the war. I was there from about July of '43 until we left in August of '45 after the German surrender.
And don't you tell the story that in your opinion, your color blindness may have saved your life?
It might well have. I tell you, as disappointed as I was, a fellow named Steve Finney and I were great buddies. He was a cryptographer too, and we were out on the flight line one day where the planes landed. Our group hadn't yet gotten operational. We were still training. And a B-17 from another outfit came limping over the pine trees and making our runway, and when it passed by, you could see through it. It was so shot up, and it hit the runway, shedding parts. Ground looped to stop it. Ambulance went screaming out to get those kids. I turned to my friend and I said, Finney, Eisenhower knows how to run this war, and if he doesn't want me to fly, I think I'll go along with him.
You can reconcile yourself to that decision?
Yeah, that's right. It was really tough. Of our original crews, I think 1/4 of them made it through their assigned missions in the early days.
And since you were there during those years, you made it into London to experience the Blitz firsthand?
Well, the real Battle of Britain was over, but the what they call the fire blitz. They really attacked London with incendiaries, and I was there often. And shouting defiance at the German airplanes dropping the incendiaries. And then they started, you may have recalled, the V1s and the V2s. The V1 was a little ramjet type of they call it a buzz bomb, and they poured in, and they came right over our base usually, but they were heading for London. But if one of them, if the engine stopped on one as it went over the base, we all hit the ground, because that's the way they signaled that they were falling. And the V2s were the rockets. And I guess our early Redstones and our early work in rocketry here was inherited from Werner von Braun, who did the work on building the V2. It was a devastating weapon, and rumor had it that the Germans had expected to put an atomic warhead on that thing, and if they had, England would have been obliterated.
And you also participated in some special services programs where you spoke to people, I understand?
Oh, well, yes. We had a special service office, and they did a little PR work, and maybe some woman's group, literary group or something, would want a speaker. And I got involved in that and went out and talked to them about America as well as I knew America. I was a small-town boy from one state, but I had journeyed about enough to tell them that it was a vast place, and if they talked to somebody from each of those places I had been, they might get a different picture.
And what was the mood of the troops and the people there?
I tell you, they were amazing, because they really took a blasting, and they were tough. I think if I wanted somebody to help defend a position, I would get me some British. If I wanted somebody to attack and take a position, I'd get Americans.
And the outcome of the war at that stage was not at all certain.
Not at all. That was one of the worst parts about being in it. You see, I was not in grave danger. I was not on the front lines, but I tell you, we began to wonder if we might be rotated for old age.
Because
it could have
war would
lasted,
go on and on.
For decades. It could have gone on and on, we thought. It was nip and tuck for quite a while.
And how did you come to learn about the end of the war in Europe, VE Day and VJ Day? Or those must be memorable days in your life.
We got the type of parachutes you drop supplies to the people in Europe that had color. They were all different colors. And we strung them up in a hangar, and we got barrels of beer, and we had the greatest celebration you ever saw. And turned lights on at night on VE Day. I didn't get to London. I saw pictures of what happened in London, but there hadn't been any lights on at night in England since 1939.
And you came home on the Queen Elizabeth?
Yeah. When the war ended in Europe, they started disbanding a little bit, and people who had enough service could get discharged. So those in our outfit who had enough were put aside in a replacement depot, and they rushed us home so that we could go to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and transition to B-29s from B-17s and go to the Pacific. Well, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on the Queen Elizabeth, we learned that they had dropped a thing called an atomic bomb on Japan. And by the time we got to New York, and it was only about a 4-day crossing, the Japanese had made some conditions on surrendering, one being, I think, that they be allowed to keep their emperor. Heard no more till I got down to Camp Gordon in Augusta, Georgia, and got out on my 30-day furlough, the only time I ever got home from the time I checked into the war. And long story, we had to hitchhike. The bus,
to get home?
Yeah, anyway, I got to the outskirts of Columbia, and we got on a bus. And the bus driver, there were about 4 of us, the bus driver was driving along and blowing the horn. He'd drive along and blow the horn. I finally asked him, "Fella, what's the matter?" He said, "Don't you know, Sergeant? It's VJ Day. It's VJ Day." And that was a celebration.
And there was that homecoming. Now, VE Day, VJ Day, another milestone, I suppose, would be when you learned the news that Franklin Roosevelt had died.
Oh, yeah. I was on
because he had been president nearly all your life at that
I
point.
always thought that the permanent things in life were Franklin Roosevelt as president and Joe Louis as a heavyweight champion of the world. But I was on a furlough in England down at a beautiful little town called Torquay. And I heard that night somebody said, "Did you hear that Roosevelt died?" Well, rumors spread through the army so thick and fast that you didn't believe any of them. And you know, I say, "Yeah, fella, I understand, and Hitler's probably dead too, and the war's ended." Next morning it was so, and walking out on the streets of Torquay, English people would come up to you like you were a member of the family and extend their sympathies.
Just grieving with the Americans.
Yeah, it was quite a day.
So the war is over and you're back in the States and you make the decision to go into law and to go to Emory Law School. How did that come about?
Jack Gardner again, my friend, had a...
your debate buddy.
Yeah, well, I was in his wedding when I was on furlough.
All right.
And he got me a date with his bride's cousin. And she's Mary, my wife now.
That's how you met your wife?
Black. That's how I met her at that wedding. But Jack had learned that Emory University had the only accredited evening division law school south of Georgetown, I guess. And we neither wanted to go back and kind of be schoolboys, I think, after the war experiences. He had flown in the 9th Air Force. So...
You had put in 2.5 or 3 years of credit?
I'd done 2.5 years at the university, but I had 3 years of credits, and 3 years was all the pre-law required then. Now you have to have a bachelor's degree.
So then you could be admitted to law school at that point.
And so I just picked up the phone and called Dean Hilke of the law school at Emory, and my goodness, he was so excited about a long-distance call. You know, in those days, a long-distance call meant somebody was dead or badly sick. And he said, yes, I could come in late. After all, they hadn't had a live male student since the war started. And I took a train all the way to Atlanta, Georgia. My, what a trip. And we enrolled there. Great idea. I'm glad I did.
About 50 years later, and here I'm quoting a speech you gave at the National Conference of Law Reviews, you said this to the students assembled: "I came to Atlanta in Emory Law School and made myself a part of this city for nearly half a century. If the deity should unexpectedly permit me to start over, as many of you are starting, I would head straight back here." What was Atlanta like in those days? What was it like being a law student at Emory?
Well, being a law student at Emory under my circumstances was not exactly like law school days for most people, because I went out there at 7 o'clock in the evening, and we were in class till 10.
And worked during the day?
And I had a full-time job during the day.
What did you do for employment?
Well, I worked for an insurance company for a good while. And then Jack and I got the idea that we would become capitalists, so we opened up an insurance agency. And that was going fairly well, but you didn't get any money out of it so much. You had to keep plowing it back in. And about that time, by then I'd been married. And about that time, my first son was on the way. And so I decided I better get a steadier source of income, so I went to a company that sold easy washing machines and RCA Victor radios and things of that sort as a wholesale house, and I worked there. But Atlanta was...
That was the Yancey Company?
The Yancey Company, yeah. Earl Yancey, fine fella, ran that company. And...
so you would go to school at night?
At night, yeah. One quarter I did some day stuff because they were getting the day division going again, and that offered the things I needed. But Atlanta was an exciting place from the very beginning, but it was an overgrown town. And to
you mean small town that was had growing pains?
Yeah, it had
Wasn't
growing
it Marthasville
pains. Oh, well,
years and years ago?
That's well, it started off as Terminus because that was where they drove the stake to be a terminal of the railroad, and then Marthasville was named for the governor's wife, I think. But Atlanta started that growth about the war years, I think the end of the war. And during the war, Lockheed, a company called Bell, built bombers out at Marietta near Atlanta, and the war industries and all started Atlanta's growth. And I'm telling you, it was exciting to be there. I was there from 1945 until 1991, and it was like electricity, the way that city was growing. It had problems, of course, growing pains, but also it was very exciting to watch. And the attitudes and spirits of the people of Atlanta differed from some. I think in some cities across the country, when the urbanization started and lots of outsiders moved in and they were taking over kind of, a lot of the old city fathers said, oh, humph, I'll pick up my marbles and go home if they're going to play that way. Instead, the city fathers of Atlanta said, this is great. Well, let's join up. And we kept the leadership of people with roots in Atlanta and traditions and loved the city. And it survived the civil rights struggles without hardly a blemish because of that.
The resiliency and the way that newcomers complemented the traditional people. Now, I'll talk a little bit about Emory Law School and going to school at night. Was that hard going for a newly married father and who was working during the day?
It was, but look what happened. I got to catch up with my life. The years I'd lost in the war. By the time I graduated from law school, I was only 24, and I was married and had one child. And so I didn't post, by doubling up, going to school in the evening and working in the daytime, double timing there, and I made up in my civilian life what I'd lost in the time in the war.
And do you think that law school prepared you for the practice of law in those days?
I think so. I think so. Law school, at best, and you professor, and you probably know it, law school probably teaches a person how to be a lawyer more than teaches a person all the law and all the procedures and everything. We learn to think like lawyers, and of course we learn more of the common law approach and not the code approach.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I'm sure lawyers have to learn more about internal revenue rules and regulations from various departments and all. We didn't know the Code of Federal Regulations existed, probably. Maybe the good students
So the emphasis
did.
was on state law and not federal?
Well, it was on that type of law.
And common law?
On the common law, mostly. We had some taxation, little bits of labor law, but not much. Labor law would be the wage hour laws and a few things that had come along in the New Deal years during the Depression. Not much, though, of the code type of thing.
And what impressions do you remember of your professors or your fellow students?
We had some great ones, of both. I remember Dean Hilke. That was when a dean was the senior teacher, and not the politician and administrator and peacemaker between the faculty and the university and all the things deans have to do. We had a great guy named Brian who taught constitutional law, and he would offer controversial statements, and we would burn the midnight oil debating about them. I had one professor who began to experiment in giving objective tests in law school.
That was a new development then?
That was brand new. Well, I could go on and on. I had a professor who had studied at Harvard in contracts. He taught contracts so that if you slept, you could absorb them.
Well, it must have been intense to study law that way, where it was Tuesday night, so you had 3 full hours of whatever. And
well, those who study law will appreciate what I've often said. I don't know how anybody could learn future interests without doing it the 3-hour way, because it would always take me 1 hour to get tuned up to the concept, and then I had 2 hours of pretty exciting learning.
to move your mind back to the medieval thinking.
That's right.
Well, you graduated from law school in 1948. You decided to stay in Atlanta to practice law. we should talk about the Gambrell Law Firm, where you eventually would become a partner in 1955. Those were the days of 7:30 Saturday morning meetings.
Yeah.
And in a speech about Mr. Gambrell, you said that you all thought of yourselves as Spartans, that there was some esprit de corps at the firm. What was it like to practice law in those days?
Mr. Gambrell always referred to us as Spartans, but I didn't have the nerve to remind him that the Greeks beat the Spartans.
That's right, the Athenians did.
That's right.
Having lived in Athens, I can stick up for the Athenians.
But that was an interesting law firm, and it was a very helpful part of my life, I think.
You had worked for them during law school, do I remember?
Well, I got the job in April of 1948, and I graduated, and I got admitted to the bar in September 48, and I graduated in December of 48. And I thought he said I was working part-time because I was going to school at night. I didn't appreciate it until I graduated, and then I found that we worked all night too. The old firm name was Gambrell and White, and they said they used to answer the telephone, Gambrell and White open all night. and there's literally a lot of truth in it. Mr. Gambrell, most energetic human being and one of the most effective human beings I've ever seen. He was totally dedicated. If you were his client, you couldn't lose, even if you wanted to. I mean, if you told him to quit, he wouldn't quit. He was a champion of his clients. He was dogmatic. He was, there was a sense, a lot of people thought of a slave driver, but that was not quite it. He just would not accept anything but excellence.
He was a perfectionist?
He was absolutely a perfectionist.
Compulsive?
Oh, I think that probably would.
Intense, maybe, is a better word.
Very intense and driven. And he became general counsel to Eastern Airlines. First job he ever got for Eastern Airlines paid him a $25 fee. And then he got to knowing Captain Eddie Rickenbacker.
I was going to say that's Rickenbacker's days.
That's right. He got to knowing Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, and there was a conflict between Eastern's law firm and with another airline on a matter, and so they needed to get another law firm, and I've heard that everywhere Rickenbacker looked, there stood Gambrell. He couldn't overlook him, and he got the job, and this put the firm in a little split. There were the airline lawyers, and they worked all the time for Eastern, and the rest of us, I called the dirt lawyers, like the dirt farmers.
And you were on the dirt lawyer side?
And I insisted on staying. I didn't want to get absorbed into one practice. And Mr. Gambrell was on the road doing both, and he could travel the country, and I'd find him there some Saturday night in the wintertime with no heat in the building, at his desk, going through every bit of correspondence that had left the firm all week, and then he'd go catch a plane and go to New York to do
everything I've read, including your speech you gave to the Atlanta Bar Association, describes him as a kind of larger-than-life character, almost a character out of Dickens.
Something of that sort. I'll confess, when they asked me could I do that talk on Gambrell, they were having talks done on outstanding lawyers in Atlanta, I said that I'd consider which side do you want me to take. And I could probably have taken either side and done a respectable job. He was a very hard man to work with, difficult to satisfy, and yet by being that way, he could goad you into doing better work than you thought you could do. So I owe him a great deal, and
he was a teacher and a taskmaster at the same time?
He was a principal of the Pelzer High School when he graduated from South Carolina, Pelzer, South Carolina, in about 1912, I think. And I think he wound up a teacher. He taught. He was president of the American Bar Association in 1955, I think, and doubled the membership in the American Bar while he was there.
Now, you used to tell a story when I worked in chambers of the moment you felt like you were really a lawyer. It had to do with a small legal matter, perhaps dealing with a jewelry store and someone you helped. Tell that story. Recapture a little bit of what it was like when you were starting out.
Well, It was like everything else. We handled cases and we made fees and we did litigations and all the rest. But I have often used this example, as I must have told you. There comes a time when you're practicing law when you do something that really makes you feel that you have performed as a professional lawyer ought to and have served somebody. And rarely does that involve the amount of fee. And the illustration I give is the one you're talking about. One time I was down in the C&S Bank building coffee shop where our office was, and a kid who was a busboy, kind of wiped off the counter, came down and said, "Aren't you a lawyer?" Well, that's a terrible thing, you know. You know you're going to be asked for free legal advice when somebody says that. But I winced and confessed that I was. Well, let me ask you something. And this kid had a girl he was engaged to, and she had kicked him. Well, I was sorry about that. So, well, he had reached in his pocket, and he had a ring case, a little plastic ring case, but when they injected the plastic, it didn't fill out the whole thing. It was kind of lopsided. They opened it up, and there was a ring in there that they said was a diamond ring, and I bet you if you put a microscope in it, you could have found some chip of a diamond. And he had signed up to pay, you know, about his $1 down and 50 cents a week for the rest of his life. And I looked at the contract, which of course was ironclad, and I couldn't think of anything I could do for him. Then I said, "Wait a minute, how old are you?" And he said he was 18. And in those days, 21 was maturity.
The age of
contract,
capacity,
yeah.
yes.
I said, "Come with me." And we walked across 5 Points over Peachtree Street, I think, into a storefront that had to be a jewelry shop. It had cages in the front like a finance operation, and maybe some counters in the back where they had the jewelry. And they took the money in at these cages in the front. Now I went up to this fella, and I was a young lawyer, and I could practically recite what the law was. I said, "I represent Mr. So-and-so here." He said, "Yeah." I said, "He has signed this document, but he is underage. And being a minor, he is entitled, I think it's to elect, to rescind the contract." Well, he thought that was a terrible thing for him to do, but he finally grudgingly said something like, "Well, if that's the way he feels about it." I said, "Well, that's the way he feels about it." Well, he said, "We'll tear it up." I said, "Just a minute. He attended back to you the consideration that he received, and he is entitled to have back the consideration that he's given you, and he wants his $2.50. Well, I never saw a grown man cry before, but that guy just about did. But we got the $2.50, and I slapped it in the palm of that kid, and we walked back to the C&S Bank building, and I knew I had served somebody as a lawyer, and I'm proud of that to this day. And I've had a lot of cases somewhat larger than that, but I sure was proud of that one.
That's a wonderful story. Now, early in your career with the Gambrell firm, you made the acquaintance with Hamilton Loki, who was a regular adversary but became one of your dearest friends. How did that come to be if he was on the other side? These days, of course, a lawyer sometimes falls into the trap of not liking the people on the other side.
One of the things that troubles me about the profession is that people find it strange that adversaries would become friends. That's how you made your friends at the bar. When I was a trial lawyer, a younger trial lawyer, the lawyers who generally represented, quote, your side, end quote, maybe if you represented the deep pocket transportation companies and finances and all that we did, the other lawyers who represented that sort of thing, you were seldom in court with, unless you were co-defendants. But the adversaries, that lawyer, you could appraise. You could find out whether that lawyer is worth his word, was good for his word, what his integrity was, what his professional skills were, too, and whether you had to respect him as an adversary. It could depend upon what he said. We didn't know how to send a notice to take a deposition. You did that by calling up on the telephone and saying, "Let's take your client's deposition," and say when, where, and we'll do it. if somebody said to me over the telephone, I'll extend the time that for you to file something, unless I was afraid I might get hit by a truck, I wouldn't even confirm it in a letter. And I would also know that if I did get hit by a truck, that fellow would be down before the judge telling the judge, do not default Hill's client because I gave him my agreement to extend it. Anyway, yes, I learned Loki. Ham was a character, a wonderful character. He and his wife Muriel and Mary and I went on trips all over the world together, and I'll tell you something, if you can find people with whom you can travel congenially and don't get mad at, you've really found something, because if you want to lose a friend, go on travels with them. You'll soon have a falling out. Sure enough, but we never did, and we traveled all over the world, went on adventure trips together.
You went through the Far East, Africa, South America.
We started out rafting down the Chattooga River where they made the movie Deliverance.
Oh yes.
That was our first trip. We went, yes, gosh, I can almost recite them. We went to Yugoslavia, Greece, Greek Isles. We went to a World Peace Through Law meeting in, one was in Belgrade, that was on that trip, and another in Ivory Coast, Africa. But we first went to East Africa and toured Kenya and Tanzania and climbed to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. We traveled extensively in China. We made about 4 trips to China, including one trip where we went out on the old Silk Road through the Taklamakan Desert and Kashgar next to the then Soviet border and over the Karakoram Pass into Pakistan and wound up in Pakistan. And we made 2 trips with one of the most interesting and finest people I ever met, Tenzing Norgay. And Tenzing was the Sherpa who, with Sir Edmund Hillary, were the first to climb Mount Everest in 1953. And Tenzing was just a gem of a human being. He died recently, fairly recently. We went to Tibet with Tenzing, as well as trekking in the Himalayas.
And these trips were not Holiday Inn and breakfast in bed. These included rafting, as you mentioned, hang gliding, parachute jumping.
That's right. Well, that thing came about when Ham's, I think, 70th birthday. Muriel, his wife, cooked up the idea of a hot air balloon expedition, and she threw a big party out in a park, and a fellow drove up with a truck, and they pulled out of it the hot air balloon that she had rented and the hot air balloon that Mary and I had rented, and blew them up, and we took off and flew away. And Ham got such a kick out of the notoriety of it, he just loved the publicity, that I said, well, on his 75th, we're going hang gliding, and on his 80th, we'll do delayed action parachute jumping, and laughed. Loki followed through. He found a place up at Kitty Hawk where we could go and learn hang gliding on sand where you wouldn't hurt yourself. And so we got in the car and drove up there on his 75th.
And so he kept your promise.
Oh yeah, he made me keep it. And then he found a place on his 80th that we could jump out of an airplane in a parachute. So we went down there on his 80th birthday, and he and I both jumped out separately, one after the other, at 10,000 feet and floated down. It was a great experience, and I wouldn't take anything for it. We did those kind of things as well. Yeah, we had good
travel
times
has
together.
been a very big part of your life, and the travel most often included the Lokis and the hills.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and also we did things like this. We had a case that I won. I wouldn't mention it if I hadn't, you see. But Ham was on the other side, and he appealed it to the Fifth Circuit. So we naturally made arrangements to go to New Orleans together, and we stayed in a motel with adjoining rooms. And Ham tells a story that we went down to the French Quarter, and he tried to get me to drink, and I tried to get him to drink, you know, to take advantage.
So that one of you would have a hangover the next day.
That's right, and not be able to argue the case. And then we went back to the hotel, and went to bed in our separate rooms that had a common balcony. And Ham said he quietly called the desk clerk and asked him to ring him about 6 o'clock. He didn't want me to hear it. And they did, and he muffled the sound and thought, boy, I'm really noble. I'm going to whip old Jim because I'm up studying this morning. And he went out on that balcony to get a little fresh air, and he said, darn it, he looked, and you could see the light under the door in my room.
You were working over the briefs yourself.
Yeah, but we had a...
Well, let's go back to the courtroom. We're doing
I forgot to mention I won that appeal.
Did you? Well, that's very important to put on the record.
Sure. J.P. Coleman was on the panel. I've forgotten who else.
Let's go back to practicing law. We're doing this interview in your chambers, and over in one of your cases, there's a blue painted plate on a tripod, and it says Symphony in G.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a reference, I remember the story, to one of your last trials and your closing argument. There's a picture of Mozart on the plate, and the date is August 1973. Tell us a little bit about that.
That was a fascinating case of a damage suit type. An aluminum casting company had built a part for the brake system and suspension system of a Mack truck. And that thing had broken and produced a terrible wreck in Atlanta that cost the Mack truck people or the insurers in those days a tremendous amount of money. It would be millions now. It was about $350,000 or $400,000. And then they sued over against my client, the aluminum castings company. I could talk about this for the rest of this interview, so I'll skip to the chase. But it developed that Mack had really told the casting company what to make and how to make it, and they had done all the specifications. We discovered, they thought the alloy that my client used had failed, but I discovered that the Mack people, one of the engineers had discovered that it was because of a defect in their specifications that really caused it to break. And I was trying to get that across to a bunch of lay jurors. One lady seemed rather prominent on the jury, was a musician. And we had the layout of the suspension system of a Mack truck on a board. It looked like an engineering drawing of chaos. And I tried to describe to them that this harmonizes to an engineer. It's just like a symphony. And then I likened the whole thing to a symphony where Maestro Mack had assigned my client, Peter Petto, the wrong part in a symphony. And every time it came to that and he played it just as Mack had told him to, it was harsh and discordant and ruined the symphony. And so finally Mack quit and said we'd never play it again. But one of the musicians discovered that Mack had made the error, and once they put the parts correctly, the symphony sounded good, and said that's what happened here. Mack described this part and specified it, and the jury was out 20 minutes, and we won it. Again, I would not have told you about it had we not. Incidentally, I then went on the court, and they got a new trial because of an error in the charge and the instructions. And I think they paid a substantial amount to settle it.
To settle the case?
Yes. And I assume that's because they didn't have me, don't you?
I'm sure of it. Now, one of the most famous, perhaps, cases of your days with the Gambrell firm was Reynolds versus Reynolds.
Oh, that wasn't a case, that was a career. It really was.
Now, that has all sorts of angles to it. Judge Phyllis Kravitch and her father were part of that case. Smythe Gambrell, of course, was involved. You described it later as one of the most bitterly contested domestic relations cases in the history of the United States. Tell a little bit about the Reynolds case. And
well,
your
Mr. R.J. Reynolds, who was the tobacco heir, had bought Sapelo Island in McIntosh County, Georgia, and had a mansion over there. And it was while he was there in Sapelo residence that he worked a scheme, really, to get rid of his wife. I'll put it quickly. Involved a trip to Europe with spies around her and that kind of thing. But anyway, it's true they had employed the Atlantic Coast Bar Association But the lead counsel was Mr. Aaron Kravitz, Phyllis Kravitz, who's now judge on our court, father. And Smythe Gambrell represented Muriel Reynolds. And we tried that case. Down there in that little courtroom, we took an entire motel for our headquarters. We had file cabinets and secretaries and the whole setup. We tried it for weeks or so, several weeks. Mr. Reynolds was so wealthy that if he wanted to, just on a whim, he could have made anybody in McIntosh County fixed for life financially if he chose to. It wouldn't hurt him. Nobody expected that he would, but nobody, I think, wanted to disqualify himself should he come to that conclusion. So it was hard, really, to get our jury mad at Mr. Reynolds, and so we would lose the case, and we lost the case first go-around, substantial alimony, but nothing like appropriate. And then we got it reversed in the Supreme Court on some 47 different exceptions because the judge was also rather carried away with Mr. Reynolds. And he would rule in favor of anything Aaron Kravitz said. And Aaron was so thrilled at being in the courtroom where he couldn't lose, he kept asking for things he shouldn't have.
For more and more,
That's
yeah.
Right. That's right. And we tried it twice. And then it was finally settled for something in the neighborhood of $1 million. But there were a lot of things in there I could tell you about. Mr. Reynolds got married after the first trial, but it was a sort of real nice-eye because when we got the divorce set aside, he was suddenly unmarried.
Isn't there a story that Mr. Gambrell dispatched you to do a little detective work and sleuthing of your own and walking through airports and sort of things
after the first trial? Oh, well, it take too long. But Reynolds could not even come and attend his own trial because he was suffering from emphysema and couldn't leave his rooms over there on Sapelo. So we offered to postpone it, but no, the judge said we had to go ahead. Anyway, right after that, I followed a fellow that I knew was going to meet him in New York. I got on the airplane and watched him get on the airplane, and then I went up there and took pictures of Reynolds leaving, shaking the dust of Sapelo off of his feet as he went to Europe.
Have you and Judge Kravitz ever talked about that case
sure,
now that
sure.
you're colleagues?
Sure, we do all the time, yeah. Lots of times talk about some of the strange things that happened there, and there were many strange things. I think I could take the rest of this little interview and talk about it, but she had tales to tell me I didn't know that were going on. And
Now, Judge, did you really once offer into evidence the Constitution of the United States during your lawyer days? I remember a story that I think Bob Richardson tells on you that you did that.
That's right. Well, I had some case, I think it was involving the Interstate Commerce Commission, appearing before some Interstate Commerce Commission judge. And I thought he was running roughshod over my client's rights, and I couldn't seem to get it across to him that what my client was entitled to, at least, you know, as a citizen. And so I got Bob to go buy one of these little fake parchment constitutions you can buy. You've seen those things. And when we resumed the session, I told the judge I wanted to offer this in evidence so that he'd be familiar with it as we proceeded with the case.
And afford you due process.
And, yeah, well, just what was in that document there.
Well, now, around this time, I guess you begin to identify yourself as a Republican, and I want to differentiate between your lawyer days and your judge days. I think that's a critical distinction. Talk a little bit about your political identification before you became a judge, since, of course, we're in Atlanta. That's the solid Democratic South, and you develop into a Republican. How did that come about?
Well, there again, you could kind of filter it along. Interestingly enough, my father, the druggist in Darlington, was the Blue Eagle chairman for Darlington County, and the Blue Eagle chairman had that Blue Eagle poster of the NRA, National Recovery Act, Roosevelt's thing. Very enthusiastic. I began, I think it was after the war, one incident impressed me greatly. A Mr. Ted Forbes Sr., his son was in the Gambrell law firm. Mr. Forbes was very conservative-minded economically and politically. And during the war, his service had been that he went to work for the OPA, Office of Price Administration. The economics of the country was put under strict control throughout the war, and had to be. And he recognized that, and he was willing to work in it, but he yearned for the day when those controls would be unleashed and business and all would get back to normal. Well, right toward the end of the war, he told me he went to a meeting they had of administrators of some of these agencies and things, and he thought they would be planning how to break them up and get rid of them. And he said, all of these people up there saying, now look, we've got what we need, we've got to perpetuate it, we've got to do something to keep controls. And that caused me worry. It caused him grave worry. And I think I began to be Republican-minded, and another thing impressed me. In those days, as you said, the South was the solid South. It was 100% Democratic. And I noticed that neither one of the national parties would pay much attention to Georgia.
Because it was taken for granted?
Not only taken for granted, both ways. The party that was going to get Georgia's vote did not need to court Georgia, the Democrats. And the party that would like to have Georgia's vote would make a grave mistake to pay much attention to Georgia, because that would make somebody mad, and it certainly wouldn't get them Georgia. So there was no reason to pay any attention to Georgia, and that irritated me. I have often wondered in recent years if Georgia had been solid Republican, would I have tended to want to
turn
move
into a
Democrat? I don't know. In order to, what I wanted to do was make each party feel they could win or lose that state's vote. Then they would come courting. I stuck in my drawer a little thing. I was trying to work up a slogan, and I finally quit because my rhyming was no good, but it came out something like, I want to see how they act when they're trying to get Georgia back. And you know, it's worked. Boy, Roosevelt or a Democratic candidate would come, but he wouldn't come to Georgia, he'd come to Warm Springs.
Yes.
Roosevelt Shrine at Warm Springs. That was all right for the rest of the nation, to go to Roosevelt Shrine. But if he was seen courting Georgia, a lot of the nation would dislike him, and you'd lose that and gain nothing. But now Georgia gets quite a play. The solid Democratic South did produce seniority in the Senate.
And on the committee
things
system.
like that, yeah. And so people like Dick Russell were splendid leaders. Ought to have been president, though, and never could. Be no chance of him being a president from Georgia. Well, Jimmy Carter did. And it was not unexpected, you see. So I think going Republican and getting Republican efforts in Georgia was a good idea.
Now let's go back to 1963 and your decision to leave the Gambrell firm and to found your own firm that began, as I understand, as Hurt, Hill and Soseby, and would become Hurt, Hill and Richardson. Well, talk about the decision-making process to leave the Gambrell firm and go off on your own.
Well, I was not irritated or mad or anything at the Gambrell firm, but as I described to you, Mr. Gambrell was not the sort of person with whom you could mature, because he was the whole operation, and everybody else reflected, and their lives reflected him. And if you wanted to really mature and be an independently known professional, you couldn't do it there. And so Charles Hurt had been in a large firm, had a large clientele, and that firm's lawyers wanted to merge with another even larger, and Charles did not like the notion of a great big firm. He liked
now great big in those days was how many lawyers?
Oh, maybe 20 or 25.
That would be a big firm.
A big firm, sure. I think the firm that's now King and Spalding might have had 40 lawyers. But he was left with himself and his son and one other fine young lawyer, and a pretty good stable of clients and pending cases. And I fit right in because I could handle the cases and had very few clients. And we had an understanding we didn't steal clients from the Gambrell firm. That was not enforceable, but because it was not enforceable, you had to abide it.
Gentleman's agreement.
Yeah, on the theory that an honest man pays his gambling debts, and the reason is that they cannot be enforced. But it fit well, and a fellow named Hugh Soulsby, who had been a district attorney in Forsyth, Georgia for about 10 years, came with us. I think he really had hoped someday to become judge down there, but the judge was a fine fellow that he liked, and he wasn't going to try to unseat him, and he saw no chance to become judge. And within a year, he was commuting from Forsyth, about 60 miles away. Suddenly the judge died, and you've heard of people being drafted for office so they'd like to claim it. Well, Hugh definitely was. The people of that circuit called him. He couldn't do any work for the phone call saying, you've got to come down here or else so-and-so will get the job. And so he left us. Bob Richardson.
I was going to get to Bob Richardson,
Bob
another
Richardson
one of your dear
had come
friends.
right after we left, right after I left. He was a little irritated in me. Why didn't you tell me you were going to leave so I could leave too? And I said, well, I didn't want to establish the notion that I was starting a raid on the Gambrell firm, so no, I didn't tell you. But he came over, and then we did get into a spot where a lot of people found out that we could live outside of the firm, and they'd like to try it too. And we finally made a rule that we would not talk to anybody from that firm about joining us. And we told that to a guy. And the next thing I heard, Bob came to me and said this fella had come to talk to him. And I said, well, you told him we couldn't talk to him if he was with the Gambrell firm, didn't you? He said, yes. But he told me he quit this morning. So
now he wanted to talk.
So he could talk to us. That,
what kind of clients did you have, Judge?
We had a pretty good stable of defense-type work in civil litigation. Charles Hurt did a good deal of estate work and estate planning, wills, and corporate work. He had several pretty substantial corporate clients, and we had one hospital. His son, Charles Hurt Jr., was then and is now just a terrific tax lawyer, and he did a lot of taxation and worked with that estate planning in that area. Bob Richardson, besides being a litigator, a top-quality litigator, also had some political things, and we did a little, I prefer to call it legislative liaison work. Some call it lobbying, and we appeared before committees and that kind of thing. Bob was the counsel for the Atlanta Recreational Authority that built the stadium, that got the Braves, and that's generally the practice. It was a lot of trial work. I did lots of trials. And in those days, I liked the trial work, particularly for these companies that were sophisticated, that dealt in a lot of litigation, like perhaps an insurance company or a transportation company, bus lines and that sort of thing. They then depended on you, and you knew they did, so you responded. I remember one time I tried to...
They would take your advice and listen to...
And they knew you were trying to give them the correct advice. I often called a client and said, look, we can settle this case for so much, and that's a little bit too much. But I said, look ahead and think of what you're going to have to pay me if we don't, and I think you come out better by making this settlement. Well, nothing wrong with that. To save the client your fee is the way it ought to be. I remember once I had 2 cases in 1 week. They were probably worth about the same thing in value. In one of them, I got a defendant's verdict. In the other one, I got nailed for nearly twice what I'd figured the value. So I just called up the client and said, you remember those 2 cases? He said, yes. I said, we averaged about what we expected. Yeah, but there's nothing like trial law. Absolutely
now you would try, I went back to prepare for this interview to read your questionnaire when you went on to the district court, and in that description you said that you were trying 7 to 10 cases a year. That's a heavy caseload These days, very few litigators would do that.
No, I guess not, but that's because they are litigators and we were trial lawyers.
Ah, the difference.
There's a difference. Litigation is paper war.
And pretrial.
That's right, and all that stuff, and then, but we generally cut to the chase pretty fast. Discovery was usually meeting at the coffee shop and looking at each other's file. And we'd do that quite often. Let me show you what I've got, and you show me what you've got. And then we're soon down there trying it, and it is really wonderful. I don't think anybody can know what it feels like who's not done it, to have tried a case for about a week and to have gotten a perfect result, and it was a case you could easily have lost. And you're walking back to the office from the courthouse. You're about 3 feet above the pavement. And you keep looking around, wishing somebody would ask what you've been doing. Just marvelous. And I also have told, I started to say, you know, that we now have a lot of women lawyers, but you know, in my class at Emory, we had about half a dozen women students. So it's not a new thing, but I've told women who practice, I said, if you're a trial lawyer and the jury is out deliberating, and you're sitting there waiting nervously to get the result, that's the only way you can ever know how a husband feels waiting at the maternity ward.
Waiting on the doctor.
That's right, that's right.
Around that time, you participated in a program called The Advocates on PBS.
Yep.
And this was in Boston with WGBH, which does a lot of these programs. Right. This was a debate format, and as I understand, you appeared on the program with people like Attorney General Ramsey Clark, Yale law professor Alex Bickel. Talk a little bit about that experience.
All right. Can I first tell you how I snookered Ham?
Please do that. He would want you to.
The Advocates was a program. It was more in the format of a trial. They had a moderator who sat where a judge would sit, and you had an advocate on each side of a controversial issue, and you each produced your witnesses and cross-examined the other's witnesses and made a final argument. I think during the Nixon administration, they began to be criticized because they were engaging in intellectual incest. They would have two of the same thinking people as the advocates. They didn't have any real old rock-rib conservatives, you see. And so they sent an emissary down south to find some conservatives. Ham learned he was coming to Atlanta to see and interview some people, so he pulled a deal. He intercepted him and invited him to dinner and told me of his coup and would I care to join him, and I did. And the result was we both got invited to Boston to audition, and I got the job, Ham didn't.
After Ham's efforts.
That's right, and he was mad at me ever since. But
and you did several of those programs?
6, I think, yeah, and they were quite interesting.
What was the response to them? Did people recognize you? Did they say, I saw you on television?
Some, yeah, there was some of that. And I found it my big trouble was, you mentioned that questionnaire. Before I got on the court, the FBI people were asking questions, and one of them said, have you ever done anything in public that's controversial?
Oh.
I said, oh my goodness, if they weren't controversial, there wouldn't have been any good programs, because we had the Nixon tapes. Should Nixon be required to turn over the tapes? And I was defending against that. And we had the Fourth Amendment, the first time I ever really got involved
in the exclusionary rule?
Exclusionary rule on the Fourth Amendment. And I tried to figure out some way to avoid that suppression of material evidence and yet defend the Constitution. Pretty good stuff, pretty good stuff. I enjoyed it.
Now, you have been active over the years in many organizations. I want to ask you about one, but just to list some of the organizations you've been part of course, the American Bar Association and the Georgia and the Atlanta Bar Associations, the American Law Institute, the Judicature Society. You are a life fellow in the ABA Foundation and a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. And you've been on the board of visitors of Emory. But the one I want to ask about is the Old Warhorse Lawyers Club. You've held high office at that organization.
I was president of that organization. It's a marvelous organization. Professional organization of chosen lawyers that we invited to come into it. And we had our aims. The motto was, we aim at nothing and seldom miss. We had dinners, and they were mostly trial lawyers, but just the old war horses at the bar. A grand bunch of people.
Telling stories?
Telling stories, and we had people come and talk, and it was a bar group, and it had professional interests and all that, but we didn't take ourselves too seriously.
Now, you've been, of course, on the bench for these many years, and you were also a fine trial lawyer who had to present difficult, often technical issues to juries. There is some discussion has been some discussion over the years that some cases are too complicated, too technical to be presented to a lay jury. And certainly you've dealt with those kinds of cases and issues of metallurgy and science and the rest. What is your take on that debate?
There may be difficult cases for a lay jury, but I don't know any better way to do it. I think the main problem is in the lawyering. A lawyer is supposed to learn enough about that particular narrow segment of science or whatever that he can converse with the witness, with those who know about it, and can translate it to the jury in terms that they can understand. And if he has learned to understand it, he ought to be able to transfer that ability to the jury. If he's overwhelmed and cannot even deal with it, he's never going to be able to make it clear to the jury. Now, the other angle would be to have the experts sit. But, you know, in each of these cases, there's an expert who comes and just absolutely swears contrary to the other expert. So you're going to have that same problem on a jury of experts. And I don't know why it is not better, though not perfect, to continue to present that kind of thing to good jurors.
You're a believer in the jury system.
Yep, I sure am. I think I think that it's the best system devised. You know.
Now, you have traveled in England where they don't depend on juries,
That's
where
right.
they try cases to the judges.
That's right, and they may find that works all right, but I think maybe anyone who has to sit and determine facts over and over and over and over again would become a little bit glib and a little bit short with the person who is trying to be a little dramatic in urging his side of the case and say, oh, I've heard that, you're going to give me that old argument again, you know, that sort of thing. And so I think that would apply to a judge if he keeps hearing cases over and over. Now, it might shorten them because maybe the lawyers would not undertake to use that same argument again. But I believe, by and large, a professional fact finder would become cynical.
And you place great emphasis, great importance, yes, on the role of the attorney in this system.
Oh, man. Yes.
I know that in 1964 you were the president of the Atlanta Legal Aid Society. How would you describe the quality of justice and the importance of the lawyer, both in civil cases and criminal cases?
I believe, and I've said this before, that a court that has brilliant judges, absolutely brilliant judges, but a very poor bar, poor lawyering, compared with a court that has good, workmanlike, honest, and reasonably intelligent, but no super judges, but has a brilliant bar, that latter court will come closer to getting the right result than the former one with the brilliant judges.
Because the lawyers are the engine that run
the whole system depends upon good lawyering. We ought to have, you know, by the time it comes time to make a decision, we ought to have given to us everything that ought to be considered in making the decision. I'll have to confess that doesn't always happen, and we have to do our own independent research sometime when the briefs and the arguments are disappointing, but no, I really believe that the lawyer is the more important part of the whole system.
Turning to personal pursuits and hobbies, I know from serving in chambers that you have dabbled in photography. I know that you used to fly airplanes. Travel, you mentioned, is one of your interests. But one of your lifetime passions has been the game of golf. What would you say for posterity about that game?
Well, just to admit that you play the game almost submits you to the appointment of a guardian.
But you're a big fan of the sport. You have Masters tickets that you
We've been going to the Masters every year for 30-some odd years. A bunch of us go, and I wouldn't take anything for golf. I really took it up seriously to play it late. I was 40 at least before I started trying to play it, and you can tell it. People ask, do you play golf? And I say that is being debated among the people who have observed.
Judge, I look around the room and I see there's a certificate on the wall over there for a hole-in-one in a Senior Judges Association tournament.
I got two. I got 2 holes in one. But, you know, the ball's got to stop somewhere. It just happened that it stopped in that hole twice. But, no, I really enjoy it. I have a lot of fun playing golf. It might reveal a lot about you, you know, because I think it's largely played between the ears, and mine is not played too well.
Well, taking you back now to the balancing act that a lawyer has to perform between the demands of your career and the demands of your family, let's talk a little bit about your family. You have 2 sons and many grandchildren. You and Mary have had a wonderful long marriage. Was that hard to balance with your career? And tell us a little bit about your family.
The law is a jealous mistress,
yes, sir.
So, and I'm quite sure that in those years, particularly in the Gambrell days and all, and also trying to get a law firm started, I guess I gave priority to the demands of the work. Fortunately, as you say, I had a family that would support me in doing that, and Mary had her interests as well. She taught ballet for about 25 years as well as performed. She
worked as a chemist, ballet. Do I remember,
when we married, she was a chemist. She graduated in chemistry at Furman University and had a job with the Army during the war, and after, well, she graduated in 45, so it was winding down, that job, and then she got with the Pure Food and Drug Administration. And she had appeared in the federal courts before I, because she appeared as a witness against some people who had adulterated foods or had sold foods with bad stuff in it. But, you know, she stuck by, and we had a great time. I don't mean that I abandoned the family for work, but
I understand.
I think maybe the calling of law does take precedence. You cannot, I can remember being unable to say, can we do something next month? And I'd say, as far as I know, yes. But if a judge says, come to court, that's all. You go to court. There's nothing you can do about it. It's priority. But with that exception, I think it was a good thing for me to be doing, because we enjoyed the people we worked with and all that, and we made great friends in those years.
And what do your sons do? Where are their families?
I have a junior, James Klingscales Jr., and he lives in Jupiter, Florida. He went to the University of Tennessee, came down to Florida because he got married last years in college, and just wanted to live in Florida. So they came down there, and he went to work, did some work as, you know, employee of a company. And then he got interested in politics, and he was on the city council for a good while, and then he got in the Florida state legislature and was there for 10 years as a Republican, and sort of gave it up just before the Republicans got into some ascendancy. But I always said that now he's to the right of Genghis Khan. And my other son, Michael, who is Albert Michael Hill, named for my father, and my brother was named for my father, but they had 2 daughters, so we named Mike Albert Michael, well, to keep that name going. He's the 7th, and his son has the same name and is the 8th in that line. But he went to Johns Hopkins College, not medical, but college in Baltimore, and got to working with the Baltimore Sun newspapers. For a year, he worked for another newspaper in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And then they called him back, and he's been with the Sun ever since. He did a column for him and critic of television and that kind of thing. And then recently, he is back from 3.5 years in South Africa. And he got there a year before the election of Mandela and covered all of that.
What a historic time.
And it went so smoothly that he had time then to get interested in other things, and he practically covered Africa, at least sub-Saharan Africa. And the last thing he was doing, and I was glad he got on out of there, was when he was up at Rwanda and Zaire when all of that massacre and stuff was going on.
And you have one grandchild who followed you in law?
Yep. My son Jim has 4 children. The eldest being a young lady, Kathleen. She went to law school at Florida, and she is a prosecutor for the state. She's an assistant state's attorney in Stewart. And I think she believes that all of the county should be in jail, and she gets to let those out that she thinks deserves it. But the terrible thing that she's done to me is that about 2.5, 3 months ago, she produced a great-grandchild. So I'm a great-grandfather now. And,
congratulations.
Yeah, and I'm married to a great-grandmother, too, if you think about it. But Kathy's back at work, she tells us, and the kid is doing well. Then her sister was the second of their children, and she's studying medicine. The oldest son, Chuck, is in the University of Florida now, and they have one left in high school, entering high school now. Mike and Nancy, his wife, didn't have children right away, and so they tagged right on along. They have a 12-year-old and an 11-year-old, 2 boys, who were with them in South Africa and went to a splendid English-type school over there where they wore their little jackets and their shirts
wonderful
and their
experience
ties and got a good education, I think.
You're blessed with a remarkable family.
Oh, they're great fun.
Let's go back for purposes of this interview to your career and how it came to be that you were appointed to the district court. I understand that Judge Sidney Smith resigns to return to the practice of law, and President Nixon ends up appointing you to the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia in 1974.
74.
Can you tell us the story behind those headlines?
Quickly, incidentally, I'd like to mention that Sidney Smith might have been one of the finest trial judges that ever sat on the bench. He was a crackerjack. And later we talked together. He resigned, and that's a vacancy I wound up with. And we were talking one time, and our birthdays are within a week of each other. He had been on state court and the federal court for something like 9 years. He was the chief judge of the Northern District. And if he had stayed on, he resigned at age 50, and I went on at age 50. Before he could retire, he would have had to stay on just as long as I did.
See?
But anyway, when he announced he was going to retire, and I think I can use the name, I don't think he'd mind, I called up a very good friend, Frank Love, Jr., a lawyer in Atlanta.
Who is the president of the 11th Circuit Historical Society.
That's true, that's true. We're doing this for. But Frank was active Republican, had all the credentials if you needed an appointment by Nixon. And I said, Frank, you ought to take this job. And if you will, I'll call anybody I know, and I don't know many people, or write such letters as I can. And he said he'd call me back. And he called back and said, I have sharpened my pencil and figured every way I possibly can. But he had younger children, still not educated. He had a new home they had built, still not paid for, I'm sure, heavy life insurance program, and he was a partner in a prestigious and fine law firm. And he said, there's absolutely no way I can do it financially. The job paid $40,000 a year then. And then he said, I've been thinking about it, Jim, and it seems to me you ought to take this job. And if you'll do it, I'll call who I know, and so forth and so forth. Well, my children were grown and finished school, and there was no reason why I couldn't, and it was kind of intriguing to think about doing it, and I finally called him back and said, okay. And then there's a long spell of are you going to be appointed or are you not going to be appointed, and clients saying, well, Jim, I guess I'm going to have to get another lawyer. And I'd say, wait a minute, I'm not.
Partners asking you, have you heard anything today?
That's right, all that. And somebody stopped me on the street one time and said, Jim, why do you want to be a federal judge? I said, I don't know, but I believe if they started a contest to find the ugliest and most unqualified lawyer in Atlanta and find out you were nominated, darned if you wouldn't start running for it. But it came through. The president nominated. I went up, fairly long story, I went up and met Sam Nunn I had never met, and Herman Talmadge. They were the two senators, and they seemed to go along with it. They were very nice. It was a Republican year, but they were enthusiastic. As a matter of fact, Sam Nunn took me over to my hearing and introduced me.
Now, according to newspaper reports, your confirmation hearing lasted about 15 minutes. Is that an exaggeration?
It could have been that long. It could have been that long. There was no controversy. That means there was no controversy. If anybody had appeared and said that he is a so-and-so and should not be appointed, it would have lasted a lot longer. And also there was just the subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee at that time consisted of one who attended, Ruska, I think it was, and you had to
Roman
remember,
Ruska from Nebraska.
Yeah. You had to try to remember to say, Mr. Chairman, so it would appear on the record that there was a whole committee there. But that happened, and Herman Talmadge called me in the office one day, and I know what day it was. It was August the 8th, 1974, and said, hello, Judge. I said, what do you mean? He said, we confirmed your appointment today. And I said, thanks very much. And realizing that it had been announced that the president was going on television that night and rumored that he was going to resign
his office.
Well, we were entertaining some guests of a friend's wedding that night, and we smuggled a little television set about this big into a back room, and Mary and I would get up from the dinner and sneak around and watch the president announcing that effective noon tomorrow he was resigning. And I began to think of Marbury versus Madison, and that once the office holder's appointment has been confirmed, he's entitled to his commission.
The law of the midnight judges and John Marshall.
That's right. So the next day, I went with some clients out to lunch, and when I came back, Gene Schrader, my secretary, you know, met me at the elevator and said they called from the Department of Justice and said, somebody up there likes him because he signed the commission today. And so my commission out there is district court was signed August 9th, 1974. And when people ask me from whence it runs, I always add in the forenoon.
Before the resignation became effective to the Secretary of State.
That's right. I tried to find out if it was the last thing he signed as president, but people I talked to who were counsel in the White House said that was the only day they did not keep a log on his doings.
And isn't there a story that it was misplaced in the mail, and, and there were some problems there too?
Didn't come, and we'd set my swearing in for August 16th, and Chief Judge called and got word from the Department of Justice assurance that it had been, so we went ahead and swore me in without the commission. It appeared in a long tube, you know, a mail-in tube.
Yes, sir.
And must have been chaos over there in the department that day of the resignation. Somebody had fixed it up and had fixed a label addressed to me properly, and then had put a rubber band around it to send it to the mailroom where they could affix the label and send it, and the darn thing appeared with that rubber band was the only thing holding my address on it. And I thought it was, you know, might be a historical document of Nixon's last.
Well, Judge, talk a little bit about your preparation or your judicial training, if there was some, and what it was like to move from an advocate to being the judge in the courtroom.
Well, of course it's different. It is different. You don't have an axe to grind exactly. Your client is the your client becomes the law and the people. You're representing the law. Yet I think that can be overdone. Well, right after getting on, or soon after getting on, I went up to one of those sessions at the Judicial Center they have for newly appointed judges, and it's a seminar thing where we call it New Judges School. And while there, the Chief Justice came over, Warren Burger. By the way, a person I admired very much. I think he was one of our very fine Chief Justices. But he talked to us, and we were honored that he did. But he said something I didn't agree with. He had a sort of theory that the new judge ought to be given the simpler cases and reserve the complex cases for the more experienced judges. And I'm sitting there listening to this, and I'm thinking, you're just totally wrong. I did not get up and tell the Chief Justice that he was totally wrong. But I thought that because I thought he overlooked the fact that I had been an officer of that court and state court for 26 years, occupying a high office in that court as an advocate, one of the trial advocates, upon whom a lot depends. Sometimes more depends upon the work and hard work of the advocate than the judge. The judge is important. But I think, as I've said before, I think lawyering is a big part of it, and maybe the most important part. And so when I moved from counsel table and just moved around and got on the bench, I was still in the same arena, still working at the same function. And I didn't see that. He seemed to think that when you became a judge, you came from absolutely nothing to do with the court to being a judge of the court. Well, it just seemed to me I took a different role.
And being a good trial lawyer is the best training to be a good trial judge?
Absolutely, and I can understand the non-trial lawyer coming on the appellate court. But it just seems to me to get on-the-job training in a trial court would be a horrible thing to have to do. I'm sure some have done it and done it successfully, but that'd be tough.
And once you settled in on the district court bench, what were some of the things you liked about the job, some of the things that were difficult about being a district judge?
Gee, I don't know. I liked the people, both on the court and there. I knew most of the lawyers. And we were good friends, and I think we continued that. I once made a talk to the Lawyers Club right after I got on, and I could draw out the letters I put on a card and put in front, long series of letters, and said, "This is my promise to you." And then when I was finishing, what those letters stood for, as I remember, was something like, "If you will work with reasonable diligence on this case, I promise to remember that you have other cases," which as a trial lawyer, I wanted the judge, please do remember I have some other cases. Yeah, we had a good camaraderie. I had tough times on some things.
Sentencing?
Well, I was about to mention sentencing was, when I got on there, most of the judges would have one day set aside in the week, and those guilty pleas they had taken or convictions that had occurred, they would undertake to sentence on that day. And I'll tell you the truth, that just about wrung me out. That's a good expression. I tried to give a lot of attention to sentencing because it seemed very important. During that trial, the person on trial had nothing to do with it. It was a guilt or innocence. It was the facts. Immediately upon the conviction, it seemed to me, now you address the convicted and the crime and the criminal. And different sentences were appropriate. I know that we've come now to the point that you're not supposed to have any variance.
Well, under the current sentencing guidelines, there are these elaborate formulas,
That's
and
right,
I know they're
that's
not
right.
very popular with federal judges.
Well, they're not popular with this federal judge. Judges used to sentence, and now they calculate, is what it amounts to. And as truth of the matter is, United States attorneys and probation people sentence by choosing what to charge and and whether or not to move for some relief. But anyway, I began setting one sentence after the break for lunch in a trial during the week. So I'd excuse the lawyers for 2 hours, lawyers and parties and jurors, and then I would come back in less than 1 hour and we'd take up that sentence. And by the time they came back, I'd be finished with it. But I remember once I had 2 young men before me, guilty of the same charge. One, though, had a second charge. And I think I sentenced one to 3 years in the penitentiary and one to 20. That's about as disparate as you could get, and they were probably the best calculated sentences I ever did. When you realize one of these people was so antisocial, the public was in danger as long as he was free. And the other one had fallen in, and brother, he would never spit on the sidewalk again. He was the most contrite soul you ever saw.
And that was the kind of discretion that judges were allowed.
And I think ought to be. Though I can understand the problem with the penal institutions. When in New York a fellow who robbed a bank might have gotten 5 years, and in Georgia a fellow who robbed a bank might have gotten 25 years, and they had the same background and they are in the same penitentiary, the morale problem must have been awful. So I can see some justification for eliminating disparity as a practice.
Now, Judge, every law clerk who's served in your chambers finds out one way or the other that you have a thou shalt not commandment never to refer to the district court as the lower court.
Yeah, that's right.
Talk about that.
Well, I think, I don't know whether it's a lower court or not, and I am comforted by the fact that when I went on the Court of Appeals, we were at the judicial conference in Houston when I was sworn in. It just happened that it came through there and I got sworn in, and our circuit justice was Lewis Powell, who I think is one of the finest gentlemen I ever knew. And when we got back home, he had written me a letter, and he said, this just confirms what I said to you in Houston, and congratulations on being appointed to the Court of Appeals, and then about you'll be a fine judge and all. But his last paragraph said, you'll notice I said appointed and not promoted, because in my view of the hierarchy of the federal judiciary, the district court is at the top. And that comes from the Supreme Court justice, I thought is right. Yeah, it's not a lower court, it's a trial court. We refer to the trial court or the district court in our opinions, but I don't ever say the lower court unless I'm talking about this court vis-a-vis the Supreme Court. I'll refer to it that way sometimes. That and split infinitives. I don't know where I got that. Some grammar teacher must have impressed me.
Dr. Fowler, maybe, I'm not sure. Let's move to some discussion of the Constitution in the Bill of Rights and civil liberties. In an early IRS case where the government was ordered to return some taxpayer records, you said this, and I want to quote you. It is significant that the citizen elects to enjoy his freedom. He isn't required to justify it. History does it for him. Now talk a little bit about the Constitution and civil rights and civil liberties and the role of the independent judiciary.
Sure. Well, I remember how that came about. Incidentally, that was a splendid lawyer for the government, but he did fall into the trap of saying, well, if there's nothing in here bad, why does he object to my keeping it? You know, and that's when I put it down. He doesn't have to justify the right to his own property. The Constitution established that. Our system is a terrific one, and everybody seems to talk about it as being democracy and the will of the majority and all that. And that's so, except for one thing, the most anti-democratic part of the organization is the Bill of Rights. It is an absolute limitation on the monarch. The monarch cannot do certain things. And our monarch is we the people.
The majority?
The people cannot. The governor of the country is the people. And the people have sworn in the Bill of Rights that they will not deprive a person of life and liberty without due process of law. They have said in the Bill of Rights, no matter that they know, have had a divine revelation of what is the absolute correct religion, they cannot establish a religion in this country. They know that the old man's home is his castle, has some real meaning, and that you can't just take a sweep through a section of town and go in everybody's house, as the English had been doing at the time of the Revolution, looking for
writs of
patriots. Sure. All of those things are limitations, established to be limitations, on what the overwhelming majority want to do. And they can't do it. And therefore, it frustrates the heck out of all of us. And I'm talking about me as a member of the public.
But how do you see your role, or as a judge, or the judicial branch's role in this system, if the majority is doing something and there's some question of whether or not it does violate the Constitution?
You have to, the court, as Marshall said in Marbury versus Madison, it is the court's function to declare what the law is, and particularly in nature of the Constitution. Rightly or wrongly, by the way, and I'm sure, don't get me wrong, I don't think the court is inviolate. It can be wrong. We can be wrong, but somewhere it's got to be done. And I could go into a long-winded thing that I have talked about, but if you go back to the document Magna Carta, that was a limitation by the monarch on his own power. King John limited his power to do certain things vis-a-vis the barons. And it was not left there that that's all. He just promised and said, okay, fellas, I'll do that. Don't worry about it. They set up a committee of barons. And if they caught the king transgressing what he said, they could, I think they gave him notice to cure it within so many days, you know. And if he didn't, then they, by the king's permission in Magna Carta, they would make war on him. They'd stop him from doing it. Well, it may well be that you can find a similarity between that committee and the federal judiciary, which is appointed to see to it that the monarch, the people, do not transgress what they have undertaken, the limitations they've undertaken upon themselves in the Bill of Rights. And now, this, of course, leads to a very serious problem, and I think it's a serious problem, and that is some judges decide not that we'll just have to abide that, but I also believe we ought to abide something else, and I think I'll write me another extension of the law, make me a new law, and order it be followed, and that's not what the judiciary is established to do.
How does a judge know where that line is, or how, when you are judging cases, how do you know where the Constitution stops and your own preferences begin?
I don't know how you know it. I think you ought to know it. I don't think it's all that obscure. Now, I don't have any doubt that everybody's judgment is informed by his own life's experiences and all that, and you have attitudes and things, but I think the judge ought to know when he's transgressing that. And there's a temptation to go about doing right. You know, I remember a lawyer said, well, Judge, I know you will do the right thing, after we had had an argument. And I said, well, wait just a minute, that's not my job. What I'm going to do is find out, if I can, what the law is to apply to this situation. Whether that turns out to be the right thing is going to depend upon how well all of us have done through our elected representatives in making that law. It may be the wrong thing.
Sometimes there's a difference between law and justice. Sometimes there's a difference between law and what's right.
Yes, although I think there are courts, or there have been courts, the Spanish Inquisition, for example, it knew what justice was, and it wasn't constrained by any law.
Well, let's move from the Spanish Inquisition to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit.
I hope that's quite a distance.
In 1974, Gerald Ford appoints you to that bench. Griffin Bell had resigned. He later enters the Carter administration as the AG, as the Attorney General. In your file, Gene Schrader, your longtime secretary, sent me this letter. A prisoner on penitentiary stationery writes you a congratulations letter to say, and I quote, In my humble opinion, you are an excellent choice for that important position. This from someone you sentenced to the penitentiary.
Well,
how did your appointment to the Fifth Circuit come about? Can you tell us that story?
yes. When Griffin Bell said he was going to step down, there was speculation as to who might be put on that court. And I can name people. Charlie Moy, who had, by the way, been a partner of mine in the Gambrell firm, but he had been on the district court for a long time. And Bill O'Kelly, who had been general counsel to the Republican Party at one time and a splendid trial lawyer. And Richard Freeman, who had been a Republican on the Atlanta, or the county commission, I believe, in Fulton County, and was a fine trial lawyer. And I thought one of those would surely be named to that position. As a matter of fact, I kidded them sometime, but one time I went and sat with the Fifth Circuit and came back in a smart aleck way, said, well, fellas, I'm sorry y'all not qualified to get that vacancy. And they said, why? And I said, because as I looked at that court, unless your handicap is 14 or less, you're not qualified to be on the Fifth Circuit. And, well, that would have been very funny, but one day I was in the office in the courthouse and the phone rang, and a friend who was among the Republican decision makers in Georgia, we didn't have a real big group of delegates. He said, I just want to tell you, Jim, what we had decided to do about that Griffin Bell vacancy. And I said, well, I sure appreciate it. I've been curious. He said, we all agreed that you're the one who ought to be appointed.
That was the first news you had of that?
I had no idea that I was even being considered. I would like to drop my teeth. That's the only day I left the courthouse with work undone and went home to tell my wife. And well, I called Jean Schrader and said, shut the door, let me tell you something. And I told her that, and then I went home. But ever since then, there have been suggestions, that fellow must have had some inside track somewhere and so forth. No, not a bit. Now, I had sweated it out on the district court, you know. I'd been interested in whether I was going to get it or not. But this was like a bolt out of the blue, and I certainly appreciated it.
Now, your friend John Godbold, Judge Godbold, told me to ask you for the record about your swearing-in ceremony and how you were seated not on the bench, but as it turns out, on the floor.
The commission came through while we were having that conference in Houston, the Fifth Circuit Conference. And John Brown, you may remember, was chief judge, and John Brown was a showman first class. And he thought, this will be great. We'll have a swearing-in of a new judge right here at the conference. So he had the whole Court of Appeals come up on the podium, and there wasn't much space up there, and it was kind of crowded. And I was up there, and Brown started out to do the program, and he said something like, now, Jim, and I thought he meant for me to stand up, and he was going to swear me in. Oh, no, he was going on and on and on, and I realized I was standing up there kind of inappropriately. And so I decided I'd sit down, little knowing that it was so crowded that John Godbold had reached up and pulled the chair back. And I went down, and so when I did finally get to respond to all that, I said to the district judges there, I hope you see that this crowd will reverse you up to the last minute, because Godbold reversed me right here before I took the oath.
Judge, you were on the court between 74 and 81 when Congress divides the circuit to create the new 11th. And those years were years of crowded dockets and ever-increasing dockets, new different administration techniques like the summary calendar. And then there were all those politics about the decision Congress had to make about dividing the court, and certainly there were strong opinions among the judges. Talk a little bit about those years and the events leading up to the division of the Fifth Circuit and the creation of the 11th Circuit on which you now sit.
All right, and if I stray a little from just what you asked me, bring me back to it, but I do want to start out by saying something about those years, and that is that when I first got on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, there were 15 judges. I have thought back over groups with which I've been associated, from schoolmates to classmates in college to fraternity brothers to old war buddies and partners in law firms and all the rest. And I have never been associated with such a collegial body of people as that 15-judge Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Very close to each other?
Close to each other, families even. I think there's a history of this, and I won't go into it in depth, but I'm sure that you know Judge Albert Tuttle,
yes,
who recently died. Well, Sarah, his wife, was one of the finest women I ever knew, who died before Albert. But Albert came on the court as about the first Republican appointee to a Deep South court, and he was ignored. He was absolutely ignored by the judges. And I think Sarah determined this will never happen again. And she was the catalyst that when a new person came on that court, she called Mary. I mean, we were all in the family. Sarah never spoke of Albert sitting in Houston. He'd say, now when we were sitting in Houston,
yes,
that's the way she put it, we were all in a family. It was a wonderful experience, and I think it led to a good way of working on cases, because we could sit around on an in-bank session and let our hair down and say what we thought. As I've often used the expression, say Paul Roney might have made a statement about some case, and come time for me to comment on it, and I'd say, I think that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. You're not going to ruin the law by having a thing like that happen, and kept on cussing him out for what his opinion might be. But then I would add, by the way, Mary said, for you and Sally, be sure and get over to the hotel room by 7:15, because our reservations were done at 7:30, and we want to be sure to have a cocktail before we go. We were close enough friends that we could debate with each other, and not, I would hate to serve on a court where all you could say to your colleague who had expressed his opinion would be something like, well, respectfully, Judge, I disagree. That doesn't help you get at the answer. But another thing that happened, I went in, as I say, the first time I sat, it was in bank, and I went in there, and those 15 judges, and I'm talking about people for whom I had the highest respect and regard as great lawyers, sitting around that table, hammering away at it and debating and arguing and trying to get the thing across. And I thought, you know, they don't have a fee involved. Nobody here is working for a client. Why are they sitting around here fussing about this thing? Only one reason, is trying to get the right answer.
The effort to get it right. And
I had a little sense of deja vu. And the only time I could remember that happening was in law school, when the professor would say something controversial, and the students would sit around and debate it into the night. Why? Just to try to get the right answer. There was some marvelous debating done by lawyers in the interim between those two, but they always had a reason to be advocates. And here there was nothing but trying to get the right answer.
That's the important emphasis on collegiality.